Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So for today, we got a special guest on board. Been a lot going on regarding the Federal Maritime Commission, container alliances, and just ocean shipping in general. So I couldn't think of anyone better to bring on board than Lauren Began from Squall Strategies. She is an expert in all things maritime, law, and more importantly, the FMC. And Lauren, I thought I'd give you an opportunity here to kind of introduce yourself, let everybody know who you are.
Sure, yeah. So as you said, I'm Lauren Began. I'm the founder of Squall Strategies. We're a maritime consulting, legal consulting company. Basically, wanted to be part of the conversation of the supply chain generally. I have a very niche expertise. And so I thought, what a great way of kind of re-entering the conversation and being able to help the industry all across. So I worked at the Federal Maritime Commission for a while. I was the international affairs attorney in the general counsel's office. So what that means is that I was doing a lot of our international bilateral, multilateral, kind of anything internationally related. But as such, I was also in the general counsel's office generally. So, I mean, you kind of see everything that happens at the FMC. And then, I also worked at the port. So I got the user experience. So I worked up at Port of Boston, in obviously Boston, Massachusetts, and was able to see, I went from regulating the industry to the user experience. And so what a great way of seeing both sides of the coin and really coming out and having this expertise that is experientially based. And so that's why I thought I'd join. That's why I thought that I would join the conversation with this consulting company. So happy to help anybody out there that has questions on regulatory compliance, what it means for you. I should say anything we talk about today is educational purposes only, not an attorney-client privilege, but feel free to reach out and we can talk about your specific case. How's that for a qualifier?
That's a great one, Lauren. I always talk about the fact that, I don't work for the government. My views are not the views of the government, but they should be. So that's always been my qualifier. So, Lauren, first off, we've had so much information coming out on this. And let me be clear, I love niche. This is what this channel is all about. And so we have a lot of people who watch this who have just a passing knowledge, if any knowledge, about what the Federal Maritime Commission is and the situation that's happening right now regarding global shipping. I thought this would be a great time to get you on because we just had two experiences. We just had the TPM conference out in the West Coast where Daniel Maffei, the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, 5 commissioners, each of them serve a 5-year term. They're overlap, so usually about 1 a year is appointed. They're selected by the president, have to go through a Senate confirmation, just had a new commissioner come on board. But Maffei was out there, and one of the things that has happened here, and it came out on Monday, again, we had the State of the Union on Tuesday. On Monday, we had this memorandum of understanding agreement refined between the Federal Maritime Commission and the Department of Justice. And Maffei took the stage at the TPM, talked about this, and then the next day, the State of the Union, the president got up and had a whole sentence about shipping, which I was ecstatic about. It disappointed Dooner over at What the Truck because it was only one sentence, but I was like, one sentence is like, it's great. It's one more sentence than shipping ever gets usually in the State of the Union. But Maffei had a great line at the TPM, and I just want to read it because it is the best. Does this mean that the Justice Department is taking over the FMC? Over my dead body. Does it mean that the FMC will have the resources it needs to go after behavior against the Shipping Act if we find it? Yes, it does. So you and I both joked about this is Daniel Maffei's Braveheart moment. He was up, freedom. He's up there. It's like, this is over my dead body. This is going to happen. So I thought you would just for a moment, let's talk about the FMC, their scope of and scale of what they do, and then what's happening with this MOU between them and the Department of Justice.
Sure. So the Federal Maritime Commission is an independent regulatory agency. So, that's kind of why we're laughing about him saying, does this mean that DOJ, Department of Justice, is taking over my dead body? Because he's declaring, rightfully so, we're an independent agency. We're an independent body. What that means. So Department of Justice has the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. So he reports directly to the president. Chairman Maffei of the FMC does not report directly to the president. So he is, as you said, appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, but does not have to check in. He's not part of the cabinet of the president of the administration. And so what that means is that he's on his own. So him and the rest of the commissioners, they're on their own. They are mandated through statute from Congress. So that's the Shipping Act in 1984. And so they create regs off that, and that's where their authority comes from, is the Shipping Act. And what that usually entails is monopolistic behavior, any sort of kind of bad acting that happens on ocean-borne cargo transit. So any of the boxes that go over the ocean, that's what they are regulating. They're not necessarily regulating brown water or internal to the US. They're regulating that shipment of movement of the goods. So we've talked about detention and demurrage is one of the main hot topics that the FMC is covering, and we'll probably get into that later. But so what this means, so this MOU, so the Federal Maritime Commission is a pretty small agency. They only have 120-ish FTE, full-time employees. And so, I mean, that's not all attorneys. While everybody might joke that there's only attorneys in the government, really no. And actually the FMC is pretty well stocked with economists as well. But that's not only economists and attorneys. They have regular administrative offices as well. They have IT department, they have managing director office. So like all that to say, it's not just a whole bunch of economists and attorneys that can be dedicated to if they see some bad acting in the industry. And so they really needed some extra oomph and some extra help if they were to start litigating and going after some of these companies. One of the things that I really want to point out is that when these alliances file, so they have to file their agreement, and alliances are basically just special sharing, pooling of kind of capacity. And I think you've covered that on your show before, kind of what alliances are.
Yeah.
And I actually just covered that on my LinkedIn today. But so what they do is that they apply, they send this application to the FMC, and there starts a 45-day clock. And so the only way the FMC can deny it is by bringing a suit against the alliance that's being applied for. They can't just deny it. There is no mechanism for the FMC to outright deny an alliance. And so that's part of the problem. You have 45 days. The FMC could potentially stop the clock by asking questions back, but really de minimis stopping the clock. You're not stopping the clock for very long. So you have 45 days to get everything in order, to file suit against a huge alliance, as we're kind of coming to see. And that's the only way that you can stop it. They just don't have the manpower for that. And so this is a perfect example of when that manpower would be helpful. This MOU, this Memorandum of Understanding, which it sets out its terms. It's not a total overtake. But, this is where they could borrow some of the people of the DOJ and help with the litigation that they might need.
I thought it was really interesting that we just saw the testimony of Maffei and Commissioner Dye. And can we just take a minute and both geek out on our love for Rebecca Dye, the commissioner
Love
there?
her.
I do too. I got a crush on her. I do. And it comes out all the time. I think she's just phenomenal and everything. And this sounds weird to everybody, but Rebecca Dye has been on the FMC for a while now. I can't remember when she got on, but probably one of the most knowledgeable, deep databases of information is her, and she conveys it so well. She's the one who's been leading Fact Finding 29, I believe, which is the investigation on the containers. But I was really interested in a couple of things. So I want to take a step back and talk about it. So FMC comes around in 1961. It's chopped out of the old Maritime Administration. And so you separate kind of domestic to international. It used to be the Federal Maritime Board, but it was part of the government. It was under the Department of Commerce. And so now you make it an independent agency. And FMC has always had this issue with it being under budget, not under budget, but under budgeted and not enough personnel. It was one of the reasons for, I would argue, for the Shipping Act 84 was they were not responsive fast enough to answer the way the system worked in the past. In the past, you would have to go to the FMC to get rates approved. Now it's the FMC checking up on the rates afterwards if there's a file against it. And that's because of the dynamic nature, I would argue, of ocean shipping. And I think Chairman Maffei mentioned this in his testimony, how we've let basically the unregulation be the norm. And we've benefited greatly. I talk about this a lot. it's very easy to target the big container companies and the alliances right now, but we have benefited hugely from the fact that ocean rates have been, I mean, cheap as anything. I mean, it's been, almost nothing in some cases to ship. And so now we're catching up on it. But I'm interested in your view on this. So number one, you're looking at this agreement between DOJ and FMC. Would it not have been better to plus up the FMC, just give them more versus this agreement? Because I think I understand Maffei's concern about this. He's worried that it's going to look like he's under the Biden administration when he's a completely separate commission and he doesn't want to go under. So I'll let you answer that one first. We'll go to the next couple of questions.
I think it's good having these MOUs because they're just kind of cooperative agreements. So, even if you pull up the text, which I'm sure you have that available, if you pull up the text, it's very vanilla in kind of what it talks about in the actual MOU. There's not a lot there. So, they talk about, they don't even talk about necessarily sharing for litigation purposes. Like they don't make it that targeted. That under responsibilities, they say each agency shall designate a primary contact person to facilitate communications between and among attorneys, economists, technical experts, and that the agency will confer at least once annually to discuss and review law enforcement, regulatory, and other matters related to competitive conditions in the industry. I mean, so basically they're saying we're going to have one point person from each agency and they're going to talk once a year. I mean, that's pretty low level. That's not Merrick Garland is now the chair of the FMC. It's certainly saying, it's opening the door so that there is a mechanism for cooperation and starting that kind of partnership early. And it's not even a full partnership. It's just like an understanding that the FMC says we will give you expertise when required on the Shipping Act with kind of the understanding that, but we still keep the Shipping Act and vice versa. The DOJ is well educated and kind of well versed and well trained in how to approach anti-competitive behavior and how that looks in litigation and what happens when there's enforcement activity that needs to happen on the federal government side because of these bad actors. I mean, we have a lot of people calling for, oh, let's go get them, the smoking gun. Everybody's looking for the smoking gun. I don't think a lot of people understand that there's 3 different alliances out there. And so in that, there's competition between these 3 beasts. And really, so I've talked about this before, that these were created in 2016, roughly. The alliances were created in 2016, roughly. In 2013, the Federal Maritime Commission, under the former chair, Mario Cordero, created the Global Regulatory Summit. And so what that was China, the EU, and US, through the Federal Maritime Commission, all getting together and saying, this is new. The alliance is new. What's going on? Let's all kind of chat. What are you guys thinking? And so they didn't coordinate their regulatory authorities, but they did start to kind of discuss, well, how are you guys going to approach this? And in general, what's come out from all of these discussions is that everybody kind of reviews the alliances as long as they're around 20 to 30% market share, they're okay. And so, we have these 3 major alliances, but they still are all in the 20 to 30% market share each. So they might make up 80% of the entire industry collectively, but they still are 3 individual alliances that are still competing for the shipping business.
Right. And like I said, I did an entire video on the alliances, but you're exactly right. I think one of the things that makes this a lot different right now is obviously the supply chain crisis. I mean, ever since COVID, and the supply chain crisis has really amped up this issue. Now, I've talked for a long time, 9 companies control 85% of the trade, but I'm a guy who's advocating for US shipping. But what concerns me about this at this time is the Biden administration comes out with this press briefing and on February 28th, and this is what it looks like right here, lowering prices and leveling playing fields in ocean shipping. And they take a look at that like almost this is cartel-like, this is, and more importantly, they're almost placing the blame for 1,000% increase in freight rates solely on the ocean carriers. Now, don't get me wrong, I've been critical of the ocean carriers, and I may have mocked the World Shipping Council once or twice in my life. But I have to sit there and say, number one, I don't think the ocean carriers manipulated the system to get freight rates at the level they did. This was a conglomerate of issues all came together at the same time. On the flip side of that too, I think there's concern about going into the future as these alliances begin to weed out. I mean, we saw Hanjin fallout in 2017. There's a good potential that once things don't return to normal, but level down a little bit, there could be some cutthroat there, cutting each other out. And I think there needs to be more protection going forward because we are seeing consolidation. I'm just really interested in your perspective on that. I mean, obviously, the issue with the Biden administration really targeting the container alliances, and then whether this is a good, safe measure for going forward.
I mean, so let's go to the Hanjin model because everybody thought too big to fail, too
Right.
big to go bankrupt. I mean, nobody saw any sort of ocean liner going out, ocean carrier going out. And so,
Especially
that's
Hanjin, the seventh largest liner in the world and heavily supported by the Korean government too, I might
well,
add.
exactly right. And so that's the thing is that, if we were to remove alliances and remove the demand, everything drops out and you might start having more bankruptcies then. I mean, there's some carriers in these alliances or who are benefiting from and probably still alive because of the creation of the alliance. So right now they're making billions of dollars. Step back 10, 15 years, they were lucky to break even or cover their operating costs. And so, a lot of people are coming to the supply chain world right now and just seeing what the state of play looks like right now. But if you were to back up and kind of look through all of history, it's been who can be more creative, who can actually kind of decide, well, who can kind of figure out the best way to move forward. So this is still a little bit of an experiment. I mean, like I said, these alliances have only been around since 2016. So they are still pretty much an experiment. They've only been around for what, 6 years? I mean, that's not long at all. And so in the past 2, they made billions of dollars. It's not necessarily because of the alliance creation, because like you said, we benefited from having very low rates for a long time because we were able to, instead of requiring all of these ocean carriers to buy more vessels and overflood these routes, we were able to allow the vessels to be kind of shared and so pooled. And so the cargo can then, instead of creating a new service between Port A and Port C, you can borrow Port A and Port C from another carrier. And so, it gave more service availability for the shipping public. It really kind of served all of us well. And so, the administration coming out and saying that these are cartels, I'm not saying that their hands are clean. I'm not saying that they're totally immune or totally correct in everything that they've done, the ocean carriers. However, their creation is not that of a cartel. There is competition. There are 3 major alliances, out there. So there's the Alliance, THE Alliance, sometimes called the Ocean Alliance, and there's 2M. And so these 3 different areas are very important to know that they are competing. And so a cartel would mean that they're all together, that they control 80% as one entity. And so there's a little bit of a misunderstanding there. So, are they cartels? Are they doing bad things? Maybe. And that's kind of why the FMC is starting to dive into some of the topics. And so that's where we start to move into detention and demurrage. Is detention and demurrage, or are either one respectively, being assessed improperly? You betcha. I mean, there's been a lot of cases already anecdotally mentioned, and a few cases actually brought to the FMC that show that there is unfair demurrage and detention practices out there. And the thing that the FMC is really starting to dive into and realize is that, okay, that's fine. So detention and demurrage, you probably talked about, I know you've talked about this before, but it's basically the rent of using either the cargo box itself or the space on the yard that it takes up. And so it's supposed to be used to incentivize the movement of the goods, to get your stuff out of the box or to get your stuff off the yard, to keep freight moving. And so by not having good parameters on why or how or when that's billed, you start to build in some problems. Like you have to send the invoice within 60 days of the demurrage right now. And so there's that rulemaking that's currently in front of the FMC. They want to hear, would you like a 60-day requirement? Does it need to be more? Is it a 90-day? Because currently you can send a bill 5 years later. I mean, at that point, you don't know what happened.
Right. And I'm glad you talked about detention and demurrage because I think that's really a critical issue. Just to get back for 1 second, we'll come back to D&D, is you're exactly right about the alliances. And again, the idea that they're coordinating, again, you look at some of these alliances, I always look at the ocean alliance as the weirdest group of 3 companies I've ever seen in my life. It's Costco, the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, it's CMA CGM, a French company, and then it's the Taiwanese Evergreen. It's like, these are 3 groups that you would never expect to be together. And like you said, is there coordination? Probably, but I don't know how you find that either. That's a whole other issue that I think they're getting into. But
Well,
go
sorry to
ahead.
stop you, but I also want to point out it's not rate setting. And so that's why
Right.
it's not a cartel. It's not rate setting. It
Right.
used to be way back when conferences were a thing, when it was kind of like a rate membership.
Oh yeah.
It's not rate setting anymore. It's just sharing of space.
Right. And it's route sharing. And I think that's the key thing that they talk about more than anything else. And again, I do think there's concern about the future, because if we do, if we see that, the alliance get hammered out, or if they start targeting, if Maersk does what Maersk does and target somebody and run them out. But it's harder to do that now too, because you really can't take the losses like they did. And I agree about the profits too. I mean, everybody looks at the fact that in 2021, the container liners made as much profit as they did in the past decade. And they sit there and go, wow, those are huge profits. I always go back there and say, wow, it really stunk back in the 2010s. It's like, man, this is terrible business models they had. They were squeaking, they're barely squeaking by. It was like just bad. And so it really shouldn't look at that. But to get back to detention and demurrage, because I think that's the issue that has really been the FMC's bread and butter for a long time. And they've been really constrained on a variety of issues. Number one, data. I mean, you and I watch FMC hearings, and if anybody watches it beyond us, they'll be bored to death, because we're talking about data, is collecting information all the time. And that's the key thing, because everybody's proprietary. It's so hard to gather data. Prior to this supply chain, we know that ports and terminals were offering free sitting for your containers for long periods of time. That's worked into deals, and so when the Port of LA and Long Beach starts sitting there saying, well, we gotta get these containers off after 9 days. Well, there's agreements that say they can stay longer. We have to be careful about that. And then the other issue is also that dichotomy between the administration and FMC, where the FMC says we're going to fight excessive detention and demurrage, where at the same time the port envoy is talking about excessive detention and demurrage being used to motivate to get containers off. So I just thought maybe you talk a little bit about that detention demurrage in a little more detail, and why that's such a key issue, because I think that's the one that impacts shippers directly, and their inability to basically they're at the mercy of the ocean carrier, and it's the exact way you would sue somebody, I think, in some ways.
I mean, so that's it. So let's focus in on demurrage, because that's an easy one. So demurrage is basically when the cargo box comes off of the ship and it sits on the yard, and so it's sitting there. You're not required to come the second it gets off the ship. For the most part, you're going to be allowed a week, maybe 10 days, maybe 5 to 10 days is probably like the average.
And those are usually business days, because they have free days on weekends. They have a whole calendar that you get and look at. Go ahead.
Right. And so, so it's you get a reasonable amount of time to come get your stuff. And so it comes off the ship, it sits there. And so you have up to 10 days. So this is where it gets a little fishy though, or not fishy, but tough, because there's not really a good mechanism to let you know that your stuff is off the ship. First off, like you don't have that, oh, Amazon picked it up, it's on its way. Like, imagine if we had like a Domino's pizza delivery tracker. I mean, that's the gold standard, honestly, if we could just lay that model over supply chain. Unfortunately, we don't have that. I think that the industry is moving that direction. I'm so encouraged by that. But right now we don't have that. So we don't know when it's being, thrown in the oven and put in the box and put in the car. So right now it's off the ship. You kind of find out. So you get 5 to 10 days to find out where your stuff is. You hire the drayage company to go pick it up. Your trucker goes and picks it up and you move it. So that's how it works in the perfect system. So you start out.
And just to add to that too, the whole solution here is another problem too, because that box is usually isn't coming right to you. It's got to go to a distribution center or be unstuffed and repacked. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. No, exactly. Right. Well, and sometimes it gets government hold, sometimes Customs and Border Protection wants to see it, what they want to check it. They want to make sure that everything's cool. That's where in 2015, when Commissioner Dice first started looking with her supply chain innovation teams, and in fact, Finding 29, that's where she started really kind of realizing there's some demurrage stuff that isn't so clear and is really starting to gum up the system. 2015, pre-pandemic, exceptional levels of cargo movement. We were still seeing congestion when then Chair Mario Cordero was the chair of the FMC. He started to call the industry on the congestion that was starting to come around. I mean, I don't think anybody obviously saw the exponential rise, but there was some exponential rising, not to the level of what we saw happening. And so this was already knocking on the door of the supply chain industry of like, stuff's going to start happening and we're going to have to fix it. And we just had an outdated model. I mean, it's a paper-based industry. And so by having a paper-based industry, literally some truckers still have a piece of paper that they outgate with. So, I mean,
Oh,
you can't.
I talk about bills of lading and you know, if you think there's a fax machine anywhere in the world, it's in a port somewhere. I guarantee you.
Well, 100%, or DOS. I mean, like
Yeah.
the operating system DOS is probably still in a computer working at a
And,
port.
and it's funny, Lauren, you mentioned that because the way Lauren and I kind of connected was I did a video on that FMC report back in 2015, which I thought was like, holy cow, it's like they identified near 90% of the issues that we see coming ahead here, where it's like, and Mario was the chairman at the time. And, you know, he went to 4 ports, met with everybody. I mean, everybody. It was an amazing document. I remember reading through it. It's like, it's like if only this had been
Playbook for current day.
yeah, well, and some things were, and I'll say some things were, but I also think it also goes to another inherent problem with the FMC being independent in some cases, is it's hard for them to implement those reforms. I think there were so many issues in there that they hit that I think it's outside their realm to be able to enforce, because they're not really an enforcement agency. You know, they're a commission, so they don't have that, which I think is a bit of a problem because of the way we divide things up in the maritime sector. There's no one clear person in charge. So
I mean, so I do want to point of clarification there. They do have a department of a Bureau of Enforcement at the FMC. So, you know, but they're still a small agency. And so, you know, that's where, going back to this MOU, that's where they really need to beef up their numbers. I mean, and that's why this MOU is going to be helpful and is not going to be a full takeover. It's just going to be adding people, because the same way, you know, sometimes big law firms can be beneficial for litigation because you just have more people, you know, so, but the benefit of the FMC and the benefit of, I'd argue, a small law firm is you get that expertise, you get that like very specific subject matter expertise knowledge that's the return benefit of the FMC partnering with the DOJ or MOUing with the DOJ, is that now the DOJ has access to that specialized expertise, much the same, you know, to keep on the legal analysis, that a big law firm might hire a subject matter expert to come in to help that big law firm. They have the manpower, but they don't have the subject matter expertise all the time.
Yep. And you know, I love those FMC hearings where they bring in the economists and they start breaking things down, and I'm sitting taking notes and everything. I just wish they'd post that stuff because they just don't have the bandwidth to do it all the time and everything. And that brings us, you know, a couple of last questions, because I want to get into it. Is number one, I was really, the one thing I was disappointed about the other day is Maffey and Dye were there before the Senate Commerce Committee. And so we got 2 separate bills going before the Ocean Shipping Reform Act 2021. There's a House bill and a Senate bill. And this was a hearing on the Senate bill. And I was kind of discouraged that Maffey did not bring up the idea of plussing up the FMC. And it really wasn't in the House bill either. You know, instead of the DOJ, which I think is still an important agreement, I think it's important because there's certain things the DOJ does. But I would have thought Maffey would have sat there and said, you know what would make me better? You know, 100 extra people, some more money and things like that. What do you think about that? I mean, what's your view on that?
So arguably he did a little bit. I agree. He should have beat the drum like from the get-go. And I think that's the trouble, is like, they have been saying this for years. And so at one point, does it just become rhetoric and, you know, something that nobody listens to? But, you know, I was interested to know how many people the FMC still currently had. When I was there, it was 124. He said they currently have just under 120. So, I mean, they always stay roughly about there. So he did mention it. It was kind of an aside. You know, it wasn't kind of one of the main talking points. Maybe it needs to be back to one of the main talking points, because that's the thing. If they're going to be expanding the authority of the FMC, they have to put more people in there, because the current status of the people to the authorities is just barely getting by. And that doesn't mean that the FMC is ineffective. It just means that they would be so much more effective and thorough if they had more people. They're trying to do it all, but as their role becomes bigger, they've always had a really big role, but the public hasn't really understood that they had that big of a role. And to that point, I mean, you know, the president maybe hasn't ever talked about supply chain since I've been paying attention to it in any sort of, you know, State of the Union. And there we were there this week, you know, shipping was in the comments. So, you know, I think that's the FMC is, I'll say it, woefully underfunded. I've also said that they are a lean agency. I mean, they get by with 24 million, I think is what their budget is, 23 million. I mean, it's very low compared to, you hear about some of these grant funding programs that are coming out of MARAD DOT. So, to kind of go back a little bit. So the FMC and MARAD were one agency, like you said, the Federal Maritime Board. They split apart for domestic, international, but also for promotional and regulatory. And so where you didn't want to have the same agency sending money out to the industry that was also regulating the industry. And so that's another distinction between the two. So, but you get MARAD giving out $250 million in grants. That's more than the FMC gets for a full agency.
Right.
And arguably they regulate, they regulate 90% of everything. So ocean shipping accounts for 90% of everything that we purchase, that we consume, that we use. I mean, it's the computers around us, it's the clothes on our back for the most part. 100% of everything goes by truck, but 90% of everything goes by ocean freight at some point. And they regulate that with only 120 people. I mean, that's crazy.
It is. And you're right. I agree that they've argued this point a lot, but I thought it was just like, okay, this is the golden time now. I'm going to make a play for it right here, because, we know that, when you cut the IRS, for example, that sounds great, but what you wind up losing is tax money because people are not being investigated and they're getting away with things. And very much with the FMC, it's that, I was really shocked, like not too long ago, I got onto the Department of Agriculture site and I found like the ag department had a better site regarding ocean shipping than FMC or MARAD had, because again, well, you think about it, of course ag does. They're so focused on bulk and container. They had a great site about it and they got the money to put that kind of effort into it and everything. So I want to take it back.
They have their own building. I mean, they have an entire building. FMC takes up 2 floors of a building. Department of Agriculture has their own enormous building down on the mall, and they even have a little garden out front that they manage. So, the FMC, barely has a basement workout gym, that they share with the rest of the building. Whereas the Department of Ag has all this.
I think the FMC needs to throw into the Ocean Shipping Reform Act something that like their budget is based on a percentage of how many containers come into the United States or something like that.
Wouldn't that be something?
And then this way they can get plussed up to do that. So
maybe.
This is not new, but you and I both know that the Department of Justice did an investigation back in 2017 where they subpoenaed all the container lines at a very famous event in San Francisco at a restaurant called The Box, which I thought was always ironic of all times, because
the box raids.
right. Because The Box is the name for the containers. The best book written on containers is Mark Levinson's book, The Box. So here they are, they level this thing on them. And I think you were out of the FMC at this point. I don't think you were in there or at the time.
Yeah, I was around. I wasn't part of that, but I was around.
Okay. And then it was a 2-year investigation until 2019. They kind of dropped it and everything like that. So I without going into details, I don't want to ask you for details if you do know anything about it, because obviously I don't want you to break any confidentialities. But is this what they're looking to do now, do you think? Do you think they're looking to do this type of investigation into? Because it was a big deal when that happened in 2017. There was a lot of concern that they were going to break the alliances up, and the alliances were getting big at that time. They were just kind of really you talked about them being small, go back to 1984, the top 10 companies controlled 50% of the containers, and even into the early 2000s, the alliances were a fraction of what they are today.
I don't think that either FMC or DOJ has a mission in mind, as kind of a product of this MOU. I think that potentially, they probably look back at that and say, wouldn't that have been nice if we had a little bit more cooperation? So they see that as maybe an example of where both parties would have benefited from this moment. But I also think that, I think in general, they're not looking to break this up, but when there is bad acting, they need to go after it. So like I said, the alliances are supposed to be for non-rate discussions. What if they start to talk about rates? So that's something that should be kind of broken up. That's where the antitrust protection. So essentially when they file these agreements for these alliances, they enjoy a little bit of antitrust protection. So what otherwise might be looked at as, collusion or collaboration between otherwise competing interests, they get protected from that because the industry or the FMC is saying we're going to allow this to happen because of the benefits that society, that the U.S. consumer will benefit from. So that's why they get this limited exception to the Antitrust Act or the Shipping Act. But it's limited in scope. And so it's saying, don't talk about rates. If you start talking about rates, you're going to be going too far. And so maybe that's part of where this is going is, if there are bad acting, that they have a larger swath of, tools in their toolbox to go after that sort of thing. Because, if it does turn out that some of these 80% of the industry that controls 90%, I mean, we're talking about numbers here, but 90% of everything, is doing bad acting, and 120 people at the FMC are supposed to go after them. Like, and really, I mean, you're probably talking about 20 people when you talk about like enforcement and the general counsel's office and maybe a couple counsel here and there. So having that plussed up by DOJ is only going to be helpful. And remember, this isn't shifting of who's in charge of the regulations. It's only helping each other through resource kind of sharing. So the FMC is still responsible for the Shipping Act, and DOJ is still responsible for any of the other antitrust authorities that are out there. So where it shifts, where it's no longer ocean and where it is kind of a true antitrust monopoly, that's where DOJ will step in. But that's why they haven't stepped in yet, because these are Shipping Act concerns.
Yeah, and I think that's where, for me, the Biden administration got a little hyperbolic in what they were saying and trying to blame them. I think there's concerns. Listen, I don't think the ocean carriers don't want to go back down to the rates they were at. Obviously, they're making money, and unfortunately, they're making money at a time where their reliability is at all-time low. But that's true across the transportation industry. Whenever people are making money in shipping and freight, reliability gets low because there's such huge demand going on. But I think once we ever see things settle down, and who knows when that's going to be, but they don't want to go down to $1,500 for a box across the Pacific. I mean, I think they realize that they don't want that, and I think they got ways to fix that without dealing with rates specifically. I think they've learned, not with rate sharing, to not put as many ships on, stop building monstrous ships with huge capacity that you have to fill up. And if you don't, you're going to have to undercut all the time. So I think they learned a lot, but I think it's a good idea to be prepared for that, because there could be the bad actor in the group that sits there and says, we may need to talk about rates and do what we can do. And again, if the FMC stays the way it is, I think it would be ill prepared to investigate that, especially post what happens with the end of the supply chain crisis and where we go forward. Lauren, we've been talking for a while. I'm going to give you a chance to comment or say something in case I didn't ask a good question for you that you wanted to get in here. What would you like to share?
It's just kind of building off of that last comment that you had about, maybe it is time to diversify ports of entry. So, we have some of the major ports that, all the carriers use, but the benefit of using kind of these economies of scale ports was that you get a lower rate. And so why you didn't go to some of the smaller ports was because it might be more expensive. Now I think you see lower rate and control aren't separate anymore. And so by going to a smaller port, by going to a regional port, you're going to maintain that control. I mean, because shoot, if you're already paying big prices, you might as well at least keep some of your control. So I think we're going to see some diversification of ports of entry. I hope that we are. To your point of like, maybe it's not going to be just these huge vessels. Some of the profits that some of these carriers have been making has been reinvested into the industry in positive ways. They have been ordering more ships and more, alternative fuel and fuel compliant, emissions compliant ships, which are great because that's going to help build this otherwise kind of dirty industry, on the environmental side of things. But also it's going to, I hope that some of these profits are going to turn into digitization and updating of the industry, because now they have the flexible money to do that. Because like we were saying, it was a no sum game. Like they were not making money for many, many years. And so this is, I mean, a welcome surprise, I'm sure, for all of them. I remember learning that they were making like $0 when I first learned about the supply chain, and I almost didn't believe it. I mean, how can this keep going if they're sometimes in the red? I mean, how can you support that sort of an industry? So, I think that there are going to be some positives that come from this. I think this was just a very exceptional period of time. I think we are going to rebalance and find some sort of normalcy. I think exports are going to increase. I think imports are obviously going to stay high. But I think as maybe the economy, the US economy shifts more towards services and less towards goods, the goods will certainly stay high, but I think that we're going to see a little bit more in restaurants and activities. And so some of that extra funds that people had to purchase things is going to be shifting. Whether I don't think that's going to drop us down. I think we're still going to stay high on our capacity for a very long time, especially as kind of industries are making sure that they keep their warehousing stocked. But warehousing is expensive. There's a lot of positives. There's a lot of negatives that have happened throughout all this, but there's a lot of positives that have come from this. Attention on supply chain being one of them, and really kind of the understanding that even the supply chain links, I mean, whether it's ocean, whether it's warehouse, whether it's trucking, everybody's starting to unsilo. Everybody's starting to really come together, understand each other and their pieces in the industry, and learn more on how there can be synergies there. So I think that's where digitization is really going to help.
I think that's such a great point, Lauren, because again, I do think, I started my channel just to talk about global shipping, and I was in shipping. I did it for a long time, but as you said, siloed, drop containers off in a port. I have no idea what happens to them after that. That's not my issue. I get them off in the port and drop them off and off I go. And now you realize how interconnected it is, because man, if that port's not moving, if the drayage is not moving, if the warehouses aren't moving, if the rail's not moving, this is going to impact me. I'm going to be at an anchor off Baja, because the Port of LA kicks me out, and I'm going to be drifting off there. Or, as you mentioned before, the port infrastructure, which is the Maritime Administration. I think one of the things that I'd like to see too develop, I love this idea of the DOJ and FMC working together. They bring together that expertise. I think you're right about diversifying ports. I think that should be part of a port strategy. A port, where do we really want to invest everything in LA and Long Beach, or do we want Charleston, Savannah, Houston, Oakland, a new West Coast port maybe of some kind being developed? And I think this attention is really important. One of the things I love is people are learning what the FMC does. And I get more questions about that than anything else. It's like, wait a minute, there's this independent commission out there. It's like, yeah, it's great, and everything like that. I really want them to get like a social media coordinator at the FMC. I think they need one desperately.
They do have a social media person, so.
Well, I think they need more. I think the social media person has to be like a 21-year-old kid in there, and just because they know how to get out in social media and everything. I don't know if I want to see the commissioner. I don't know if I want to see the commissioners doing a TikTok or not.
Page, is that right? You want a TikTok page out of the FMC?
Yeah, I don't know if we can do the commissioners on a TikTok page or not, but it'll be really interesting to see them out there on that. Lauren, it's been a great talk. It went way too fast, but the good thing is I'm pretty sure we're going to get together again and talk about something else here in the future, because I don't think this is going anywhere anytime soon. If you wouldn't mind, could you just tell my viewers where to get in contact with you and how to follow you and your social media presence?
So Lauren Began, B as in boy, EAGEN. Find me on LinkedIn. My company is Squall Strategies. You could look me up, squallstrategies.com. I put out content. I host a kind of an ongoing series of educational, I call it an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain. So I want any of the regulatory legal side of things to be digestible for everybody, because if only the attorneys understand what's going on, then nobody wins. So I put out these weekly educational videos, where we just kind of talk about what's happening in supply chain from a regulatory, legal, just different things that I've seen from the industry, and try to explain them so that everybody can understand, be on the same page. Because like we said, so much of the industry is siloed that, demurrage and detention don't even mean demurrage and detention when you start going into different areas. If it's trucking or if it's warehousing. So I've been learning some of those synergies. I hate to say the word synergy, but I've been learning some of those similarities between the different industries and how we can bridge those gaps and have those discussions, because if we can all be on the same level, then we can all move forward together. And so, so reach out to me on LinkedIn. My company's also on LinkedIn. I got a YouTube channel. So find me. I'm happy to have these conversations. Love to be back. FMC has been hot in the news recently, and happy to chat about it.
Well, first off, I'll have all Lauren's information in the show notes. You can link right over to them. And so you can follow her and everything. And every now and then you'll catch me and her on What the Truck on Freight Waves. So when Dooner and the Dude will invite us back, we'll come on and talk. And I think one of the best parts about what I've done over the past year is get to meet and interact with people throughout the industry and really get a chance to educate people in what's going on with shipping, because I think there's so many facets to it, and most importantly, there's something for everybody in this. You do not have to be an engineer or a mate driving a ship to be involved in this. I've had more students talk to me about getting involved in supply chain, on the legal side, on the business side, you name it. There's so many aspects to it that it's really so important to us. And again, I think the education that we've seen done over the past year on how important supply chain is has been really critical. Lauren, I want to thank you for coming on, spending your time talking with us. I look forward to us getting on here again and talking about it. I just hope Chairman Maffei gives us another great quote that we can use to go forward with and everything, because the Braveheart quote is going to be hard.
Another Braveheart moment. I mean, it really kind of instills the spirit of like, go get them, like you got them, Maffei.
I had people from the TPM conference who were tweeting out, and I was following them. It's like, we did not expect this from Dan. Dan is showing a side we did not expect. And I thought that was great. So yeah. Lauren, thank you for being on. And to everybody who's watching, again, please take a moment, if you can, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos when they come out, leave a comment, share it across social media. And if you can, most importantly, go follow Lauren and everything she has to say. She's great. And until our next episode, this is Sal and Lauren signing off.